In the spring of 1941, as Europe burned under the weight of war, the skies were ruled by a new generation of machines. Sleek, elegant fighters with names already whispered in fear or reverence. The Spitfire, the Messerschmitt, the Zero. Into this crucible of speed and destruction, a strange new aircraft would soon arrive. One that seemed at first glance far too heavy, far too clumsy, far too late. It would be called the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It began not as a warrior, but as an experiment, a desperate attempt to keep pace with a world moving too fast for comfort. In the workshops of Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, engineers led by a brilliant but restless mind named Alexander Kartveli struggled to design something that could survive the chaos of modern air war. He had seen his homeland of Georgia torn apart, had fled across Europe ahead of totalitarian shadows, and now, in America, he faced a different kind of battle, against time, weight, and disbelief. When the plans for the P-47 first landed on the desks of Army Air Corps officials, they were met with bewildered silence. A single-engine fighter, they were told, that weighed over 7 tons fully loaded, twice as heavy as most fighters of its day. It would need an engine so massive it barely existed, and would carry 8 machine guns, 4 in each wing, each capable of spitting death at over 1,000 rounds a minute. The generals looked at the drawings and shook their heads. The engineers called it a monster. Pilots, upon seeing its bulk for the first time, simply laughed. But Kartveli persisted. He knew that wars were not won by grace or beauty, but by endurance, by power, and by the ability to take punishment and still come home. The heart of the Thunderbolt was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, a beast of 18 cylinders, air-cooled, rugged, and temperamental. It gave the P-47 something most fighters lacked: brute strength. Combined with a turbo supercharger mounted deep within its fuselage, the aircraft could climb higher and faster than many had imagined possible. Yet its size remained a problem. On the ground, it looked like a bulldog among greyhounds, a machine that defied the aerodynamic trends of its time. Its wings were thick, its fuselage wide, and the pilot sat cocooned high above a maze of ducts and metal. In those early months, many doubted it would ever fly at all. And when it did, in May 1941, the first test flights were cautious, anxious affairs. The P-47 bucked and shook, its massive engine roaring like thunder, but the pilots returned alive. With every test, the engineers refined, trimmed, and tuned. What emerged by the winter of 1942 was a machine no longer bound by mockery, a fighter built not for elegance, but survival. Across the Atlantic, Britain stood battered but unbowed. The Luftwaffe still roamed the skies of occupied Europe with impunity, and the American entry into the war brought new promises but also new doubts. The first Thunderbolts arrived in England in late 1942, their polished metal gleaming beneath cold, gray skies. British observers looked them over with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Compared to the nimble Spitfire, the American plane seemed absurdly oversized. "She'll never dogfight," one pilot muttered. "She's a flying milk bottle." Yet, within months, those same pilots would see what the Thunderbolt could truly do. In April 1943, P-47s of the 4th Fighter Group began escorting American bombers over northern France. The mission was simple: protect the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators as they struck at German factories and rail lines. But, high above the clouds, the Luftwaffe awaited. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, sleek predators that had already humbled so many Allied aircraft. When the first Thunderbolts arrived, the German pilots underestimated them. They attacked head-on, expecting the heavy American machines to crumble under pressure. Instead, they found themselves facing a wall of 50 caliber fire so dense and sustained it seemed to slice the sky itself. What the Thunderbolt lacked in agility, it made up for in sheer firepower and toughness. Pilots soon learned to dive from altitude, unleash devastating bursts, then climb again before the enemy could react. And when the Germans did score hits, the P-47 often shrugged them off. Its radial engine could take bullets that would have torn a liquid-cooled Merlin to pieces. Its wings could be riddled with holes, its fuselage scorched, and still it would bring its pilot home. On the ground, maintenance crews began to notice something remarkable. Aircraft returned from missions that should have been their last. Shot through, oil leaking, panels shredded, and yet the engines still turned. The landing gear still locked, and the pilots climbed out grinning, shaking their heads at their own survival. "She's ugly," one mechanic said, patting the dented nose of a returning P-47, "but she's built like a bank vault." By mid-1943, the Thunderbolt's reputation was spreading. Bomber crews loved it. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, though some claimed it was just Jug because of its shape, like a milk jug turned on its side. Either way, the nickname fit. The Jug was unstoppable once unleashed, but its true transformation came not in the cold skies of northern France, but in the fiery battles over Germany itself. As the Allied bombing campaign pushed deeper into enemy territory, escort fighters were forced to fly farther than ever before. Early P-47s struggled with range. Their fuel tanks limited how far they could protect the bombers. Many a crew watched helplessly as their fighter escort turned back, leaving them alone to face the black crosses that appeared out of the sun. But Kartveli and his engineers adapted again, fitting drop tanks, refining fuel systems, pushing the Thunderbolt's reach hundreds of miles farther. Now the Jugs could follow the bombers all the way to the target and back. For the men who flew it, the P-47 became more than a machine. It was a partner in survival, a fortress with wings. Pilots like Robert S. Johnson and Francis Gabby Gabreski turned the Thunderbolt into a legend, racking up scores that made headlines back home. They spoke of the aircraft with affection, even awe. Johnson once returned to base with 21 cannon holes in his plane, part of his canopy shattered and his controls stiff with damage. Yet the engine never quit. "She got me home," he said simply. That's all that mattered. Across enemy lines, Luftwaffe pilots began to change tactics. The big American fighter was too dangerous to attack head-on, too durable to down easily. Some called it der eiserne Schwein, the iron pig. They feared it not for speed, but for endurance, for its refusal to die. And as 1943 turned to 1944, the Jug would find its greatest calling not just in the air, but on the ground, as a thunderbolt striking from above. By 1944, the war in Europe had entered a new phase. The Allies were preparing for an invasion that would decide the fate of a continent. The Luftwaffe, though still fierce, was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Fuel was scarce, pilots were young and frightened, and factories were being pounded day and night by American and British bombers. In the skies above occupied France, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer an experiment, or even a curiosity. It was now the backbone of the U.S. Army Air Force's fighter strength in Europe, a hammer built to strike from the heavens. Its pilots had learned the Thunderbolt's secret rhythm. They no longer tried to outturn their opponents. Instead, they climbed higher than anyone expected, using their turbo-superchargers to gulp thin air at 30,000 feet. From there, they dove like falling stars, engines screaming, guns blazing. A burst from 8 50-caliber machine guns could shred a fighter, a train, or a truck in seconds. And if the Jug ever found itself trapped in a dogfight, its sheer momentum could often carry it through. Dive away, level off, climb again. The cycle of thunder and lightning. But the true test of the Thunderbolt's endurance came as the invasion of Normandy drew near. The Allies needed more than air superiority. They needed control of the battlefield itself. Tanks, trains, bridges, and columns of men would need to be destroyed before they could ever reach the beaches. And that meant sending fighters down into the fire. Other aircraft had tried. Light, graceful fighters built for duels in the sky. But they were too fragile, too easily destroyed by flak. The P-47, with its heavy frame and radial engine, could take the punishment and return for more. So the Thunderbolt became something new. Not just a fighter, but a fighter-bomber. Under each wing, engineers hung bombs, rockets, and fuel tanks, transforming it into a flying arsenal. It could deliver destruction with terrifying precision and still fight its way home. In the days before D-Day, the Jugs of the 9th Air Force prowled the skies of northern France. Bridges vanished in blossoms of smoke, train lines twisted and burned, German convoys scattered into forests, terrified of the relentless hum that grew into a roar overhead. Farmers and villagers looked up to see hundreds of silver shapes streaking across the sky. Thunder before the storm. On June 6, 1944, the invasion began. The beaches of Normandy were chaos and fire. Above them, the P-47s flew almost without rest, sweeping low over the sand, strafing gun positions, knocking out tanks, and chasing enemy columns retreating inland. Pilots returned to base with oil streaks across their canopies, with shrapnel holes in their wings, with their ammunition long spent. And still, they went back. "We were the hammer," one pilot recalled. "Every time the infantry called, we hit, again and again." For the men on the ground, the sight of the Thunderbolt became a symbol of hope. Soldiers pinned down under machine gun fire would hear the distant growl of engines, then see a dark shape plunging through the clouds, guns flashing. To the Germans, it was something else, the sound of inevitable defeat. Even as the Allies pushed inland, the Thunderbolt's reputation grew. It could absorb damage that would kill almost any other aircraft. Pilots told stories that seemed impossible. Engines failing, control surfaces shredded, yet somehow they limped back across the channel. Some flew home with half their tail missing, or with entire cylinders blown out of the engine. Mechanics said it was as if the aircraft refused to die until its pilot was safe on the ground. The Luftwaffe tried to counter. They sent their best, Focke-Wulfs armed with cannons, Messerschmitts diving from the sun. But the Thunderbolt met them with raw aggression. Even when outnumbered, its pilots fought with confidence. They trusted their machines, and their machines delivered. Slowly, the sky over France became an Allied domain. In the east, German ground crews began to whisper a new nickname for it, Jabo, short for Jagdbomber, the fighter bomber. To them, it was a curse word, a shadow that followed every daylight convoy, every movement of armor or supply. They learned to move at night, to hide in forests, to scatter at the first sign of the Jug's silhouette. Because when the Thunderbolt appeared, the sky itself seemed to fall. Through the long summer of 1944, the P-47 flew thousands of sorties. It destroyed bridges, locomotives, and tanks by the hundreds. In the chaos after D-Day, it crippled the German Army's ability to move and fight. One historian would later write that the Thunderbolt was not just a fighter, it was a one-plane air force. But while the Thunderbolt was carving its legend over Europe, its presence was spreading across the globe. In the Mediterranean, it fought over Italy and southern France. In the Pacific, far from the muddy fields of Normandy, it joined the fight against Japan. There, its range and durability made it invaluable. Flying from islands barely large enough to hold their runways, the Jugs attacked Japanese shipping, airfields, and fortifications with the same relentless fury they had shown in Europe. Pilots found that even under the scorching tropical sun, the P-47 could take punishment from flak and still return, trailing smoke but alive. Back in Europe, the war was turning. The Allies crossed the Seine, then the Rhine. As the front lines advanced, the Jugs moved with them, operating from hastily built airstrips cut from fields and orchards. Mechanics slept in tents beside the aircraft, covered in oil and dust. Pilots washed in helmets and flew 3, sometimes 4 missions a day. The Thunderbolt became a constant presence, the growl of its engine an omen to friend and foe alike. For German soldiers retreating eastward, the sight of the P-47's broad wings and spinning propeller meant one thing: run. For Allied troops, it meant salvation. In letters home, infantrymen spoke of the jugs as guardian angels. "They came in low," one soldier wrote, "so low you could see the pilot's face. We waved, and he dipped his wings before diving into the next column of tanks." By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was collapsing. The Thunderbolts had done their work well, but their mission was not over. Ahead lay the Ardennes, and the last great German gamble. As winter closed in, the skies over Belgium and Luxembourg grew gray and cold. Snow blanketed the forests, muffling the sound of tanks and men. Then, one morning in December, the quiet shattered. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. For days, bad weather grounded most Allied aircraft. The Germans surged forward, catching the Allies by surprise. Towns burned. Roads were choked with refugees and broken vehicles. But when the skies finally cleared, the Thunderbolts returned with vengeance. They struck at convoys, bridges, and columns of armor caught in the open. The snow reflected their fire like lightning. In the words of one German officer, "It was not soldiers we fought that day, it was thunder from the heavens." By the time the smoke cleared, the German advance was broken. The Jug had once again proven that it was not just a fighter, but a weapon of willpower, a machine that refused to quit, even when the world seemed frozen against it. As 1945 dawned, victory was in sight, and the Thunderbolt, born in doubt and ridicule, had become one of the most feared and respected aircraft of the entire war. By the dawn of 1945, the skies above Europe belonged to the Allies. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival had turned into domination. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now a ghost of its former power. Its airfields lay shattered, its factories burned, its fuel stores nearly gone. In this new landscape, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt reigned supreme, not through elegance or speed, but through endurance, through the stubborn refusal of both machine and man to break. From the frozen forests of Belgium to the bomb-scarred plains of Germany, the sound of the Thunderbolt became the soundtrack of defeat for the Reich. Each day, hundreds of them lifted from muddy forward bases, their engines coughing black smoke before settling into that deep, rolling growl that soldiers called the voice of thunder. They carried bombs, rockets, and sometimes little more than their guns and courage. Their targets were everywhere: tanks hidden in valleys, locomotives slipping through forests, bridges clinging to rivers swollen with melted snow. The Jugs hunted them all. Pilots learned to fly by instinct now. The maps were often outdated, the weather unpredictable. Some squadrons flew so many sorties that their crews barely slept. Mechanics worked by lantern light, scraping mud from landing gear, hammering bullet holes flat, patching wings with whatever aluminum they could find. The war had ground them all down to essentials, and still the Thunderbolt endured. The Germans called them Donnerschweine, thunder pigs. It was meant as an insult, but the name stuck because it felt true. When a flight of Jugs appeared over the horizon, the ground shook as if the earth itself had taken sides. They dove almost vertically, releasing bombs that vanished into clouds of dust and flame, then pulled up with the kind of brutal grace that could only come from raw power. In those moments, the P-47 was less an airplane than a force of nature. But even thunder has a human heart. Inside those cockpits were men barely out of their teens, faces chapped from the cold, eyes red from exhaustion. They flew through walls of flak so dense it looked like black snow. They watched their friends vanish in sudden blossoms of fire, yet kept diving, kept fighting. For every enemy they destroyed, there was a moment of silence, a quiet awareness that the sky took both sides in equal measure. In the final months of the war, the P-47's mission shifted from air superiority to destruction on a continental scale. The German war machine was crumbling, but it still had teeth. Convoys moved only by night, and even then the Thunderbolts found them. Rail yards exploded under waves of rockets. Columns of trucks scattered like ants beneath the roar of machine gun fire. One German officer, captured near the Rhine, said simply, "We feared your jugs more than your tanks." On the ground, Allied soldiers shared that strange bond with the pilots above them. They marked their vehicles with bright panels so the Thunderbolts would know they were friends. They cheered when they heard the engines, waving from trenches as the fighters roared overhead. "It was the sound of safety," one infantryman said later. "You heard that, and you knew. We were still winning." In the air, a new challenge awaited. The introduction of jet aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me 262, promised to change the rules once again. The jet was faster, far faster than any piston-engine fighter. But the Thunderbolt pilots met it with the same resolve that had carried them through every other trial. They hunted the jets as they took off and landed, waiting for their moment. On more than one occasion, a jug caught a Me 262 low and slow, riddling it with gunfire before it could escape. The message was clear. Even at the dawn of a new age, the old warrior still had teeth. Then, in April 1945, the war in Europe neared its end. The Allied armies crossed the Rhine. Cities once thought untouchable lay in ruins. Air superiority had become air supremacy, and the Thunderbolt's work was nearly done. For its pilots, the victory was bittersweet. Too many friends had been lost, too many missions flown through black smoke and grief. They had seen Europe from 10,000 feet, its rivers glowing in moonlight, its cities burning in orange flame, and they carried those images home with them forever. As Germany surrendered and the guns fell silent, the Thunderbolt's engines cooled on airfields from France to Austria. Mechanics leaned against their planes, staring at the empty sky. Pilots walked the flight lines, running their hands along the metal skin of the machines that had carried them through hell. Some kissed the noses of their jugs in farewell. Others simply sat in silence, listening to the ticking of cooling engines. Yet even as Europe celebrated peace, another war still burned across the Pacific. And there, too, the Thunderbolt was waiting. In the vast distances of the Pacific theater, range was everything. Long overwater flights tested both pilot and engine, but the jug proved equal to the task. From bases in Saipan, Ieshima, and later Okinawa, P-47s struck at the Japanese home islands, hitting rail lines, shipping convoys, and coastal defenses. They flew through storms, across endless ocean, guided only by compass and instinct. Japanese soldiers came to dread the sight of the silver-winged fighter. Its machine guns tore through trucks and troop columns. Its bombs shattered fuel dumps and gun positions. The pilots flew low, sometimes so low that the spray of the sea kissed their canopies. They faced not only enemy fire but the vast indifference of the Pacific itself. Storms, engine failures, the endless possibility of vanishing into blue nothing. Still, the Thunderbolt brought them home more often than not. By the summer of 1945, the end had come at last. The war that had begun in doubt and fear was closing in triumph. The P-47, once dismissed as a mistake, had become one of the most successful fighters of the entire conflict. Over 15,000 were built. They flew more than 500,000 sorties, destroyed tens of thousands of vehicles, and downed enemy aircraft by the thousands. But perhaps its greatest achievement was simpler. It brought its pilots home. When peace returned, many of the great warbirds were scrapped or forgotten. Yet the legend of the Thunderbolt endured. It was never glamorous, never sleek or photogenic. It was blunt, loud, and proud, a reflection of the men who built it, the men who flew it, and the nation that forged it in steel and courage. In hangars and museums today, you can still see them. Their olive drab paint faded, their wings patched with memory. Stand beside one and you can almost feel the echo of its engine, the hum of power beneath your feet. It reminds you that victory does not always belong to the beautiful or the fast, but to the strong, the durable, the ones who never give up. In that sense, the Thunderbolt was more than a machine of war. It was a symbol of persistence, of sacrifice, and of the human spirit's unyielding will to endure the storm and emerge, battered but unbroken, into the calm that follows. The guns of Europe and the Pacific had fallen silent. Cities lay in ruins, nations counted their dead, and the world stood blinking in the sudden light of peace. Across airfields from England to the Philippines, the engines of war cooled one final time. Among them, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt sat in quiet rows. Once a symbol of fury, now a monument to survival. For thousands of pilots, the Jug had been more than an aircraft. It had been a shield, a home in the sky. It had carried them across fire and thunder and brought them back to the earth in one piece. Now, as the last missions were flown and squadrons stood down, there was a strange emptiness. The men who had cursed its weight and loved its power found it difficult to imagine the sky without that deep, reassuring growl of the double Wasp engine. Peace, however, is never still for long. The world was changing, the nature of warfare shifting. Jet engines whispered of the future, sleek, swept-wing machines already being tested in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Against them, the old piston engine fighters looked like relics from another century. Yet for all its bulk, the Thunderbolt still had work to do. In the late 1940s, long after victory parades had faded, it served as the backbone of air forces around the world. Across Latin America, in France, Italy, and even Yugoslavia, squadrons of P-47s bore new markings and roundels, their American stars painted over, but their hearts unchanged. They flew patrols over jungles and deserts, training flights over oceans and mountains. The pilots who inherited them spoke the same words their American predecessors had: dependable, strong, unkillable. The Jug had become a teacher now, showing a new generation of aviators what it meant to respect power and to trust the machine beneath their hands. In Brazil, the P-47s that had fought in Italy continued to serve with pride. In Mexico, they guarded long coastlines and trained new pilots in the art of combat flight. Even in distant Turkey, their radial engines echoed through mountain valleys. The war had scattered them like seeds, and everywhere they landed, they took root in the memories of those who flew them. But the world's attention soon turned to another conflict. Smaller, yet fierce enough to remind mankind that peace was only an interval between storms. In 1950, the Korean Peninsula erupted in war. The new age of jets had begun, and in those skies, the F-86 Sabre and MiG-15 would duel for supremacy. Yet, before the jet squadrons could take the stage, the old propeller-driven fighters returned for one last act. Among them were the descendants of the Thunderbolt. The Republic P-47's leaner, faster sibling, the P-47's spiritual successor, the P-47N variant designed for long range in the Pacific. A few served briefly in Korea, where their toughness once again proved vital. They flew ground attack missions through mountainous terrain, their pilots rediscovering the old rhythm of dive, fire, climb. Against the brutal Korean winters and rough airfields, the Jug's durability was as valuable as ever. But the age of thunder was fading. Jets climbed higher, flew faster, and fought in a new dimension of speed. One by one, the great piston fighters were retired, their engines silenced, their wings folded. In hangars and scrapyards, the Thunderbolts were dismantled, their aluminum recycled, their engines stored or sold. To the young jet pilots who came after, they seemed like giants from a myth, creatures of a slower, louder time. Yet some refused to die. A few found their way into civilian hands, purchased by collectors, racers, and veterans who could not bear to let them go. At air shows, they roared again, their propellers slicing sunlight, their engines echoing across crowds of children who had never heard real thunder before. When a P-47 took to the sky, it drew not just admiration, but reverence. People craned their necks to watch, sensing instinctively that they were witnessing more than flight. They were witnessing history in motion. And in museums, carefully preserved beneath polished lights, they stood silent but alive. Visitors walked around them, tracing the scars still visible beneath layers of paint. The patched bullet holes, the faint outlines of squadron emblems long faded. Some stopped to read the names painted on their sides. Big Ass Bird 2, turtle's egg, 5 by 5. Each one told a story. Each one had once been home to a man who had flown into hell and returned. The Thunderbolt's legacy extended far beyond its metal frame. Its lessons shaped the aircraft that came after. Republic Aviation, forged in the fires of war, carried that knowledge forward into the sleek jets of the Cold War. The engineers who had built the Jug would design the F-84 Thunderjet, the F-105 Thunderchief, and later generations of aircraft that bore the same spirit of rugged strength. The word Thunder would remain a Republic signature, a tribute to the machine that had proven, once and for all, that durability could be as decisive as speed. Even in silence, the Jug's spirit lingers. Every time a modern pilot takes off in a heavily armed strike aircraft, they inherit a piece of that legacy, the idea that survivability and firepower can turn the tide of war. The P-47 was the first to prove it on a grand scale. It showed that a fighter could be a protector as much as a killer, that courage could be engineered into steel and rivets. For historians, the Thunderbolt stands as a paradox. It was ungainly but deadly, heavy but nimble in its own brutal way. It lacked the fame of the Spitfire's silhouette or the Mustang's sleek lines, yet its impact was immense. It destroyed more enemy aircraft than almost any other American fighter. It became the hammer that shattered the Reich's last defenses and the shield that guarded the bombers all the way to victory. And through it all, it never lost the one quality that defined it most: reliability. Ask the men who flew it what they remember, and their answers are simple. The smell of oil and gunpowder, the vibration through the seat when the guns opened up, the way the canopy rattled when diving through cloud, and always that sound, the deep, rolling thunder that made even the earth tremble. In the end, the Thunderbolt's greatest triumph was not in numbers or medals, but in survival, in the thousands of pilots it brought home when no one else thought they would make it. It embodied the stubborn heart of a generation that refused to give in, no matter the odds. That is why, decades later, when a P-47's engine starts up and the air shudders with that first growl, people still pause, still listen, still feel a quiet awe. It is the echo of a time when the sky itself seemed to wage war, and a reminder that even in an age of noise and chaos, courage and endurance can still sound like thunder. Time softens everything, even thunder. But some sounds never fully fade. They linger, low and steady, beneath the noise of the modern world. For those who once lived by that sound, it was not just the voice of a machine. It was the sound of survival. Decades after the war, old men gather at airfields, their hands trembling slightly as they trace the smooth curve of a P-47's fuselage. Their reflections glimmer faintly in the polished aluminum. Faces older, eyes softer, but still lit by something bright. They speak quietly, as if afraid the airplane might wake. Each word is a fragment of memory. A dive through flak. A friend lost over France. A cold morning in England when they strapped into a cockpit for the first time and realized how vast the sky could be. They tell stories of how the Jug would absorb punishment that would tear lesser machines apart, how it could come home with cylinders shot out, with half a tail, with control cables shredded, and still somehow keep flying. One pilot remembers limping across the channel with his engine barely running, smoke in the cockpit, oil covering the windscreen. He landed, climbed out, and looked back. The engine still ticking, still alive. That airplane, he says softly, wanted to live. Others recall the odd beauty of it. The way sunlight glinted off the wings during a roll, the flash of gunfire like bright stars in daylight, the camaraderie of pilots who flew side by side, laughing before missions, praying afterward. The shared superstition that if you treated your airplane right, it would return the favor. To them, the P-47 wasn't just metal and fuel. It had personality. Stubborn, loyal, indestructible. Some even called it she. Others, more respectfully, called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, a name born from affection and awe. In their memories, the world is black and white again. The English countryside stretches below, dotted with hedgerows and rivers. The air smells of rain and cordite. Somewhere above the clouds, contrails twist into bright threads as fighters climb to meet their fate. It's a world long gone, yet alive whenever the Thunderbolt's story is told. The historians who study the aircraft see it in another way. They trace its lineage from the early P-35 and P-43 designs to the final P-47N, from the drawing boards of Alexander Kartveli to the factory floors of Farmingdale, New York. They marvel at how American industry transformed in wartime, how men and women by the tens of thousands built machines of breathtaking complexity, each part fitting into the other with precision that seemed impossible at such speed. The Thunderbolt was a triumph not only of design but of scale, proof that a free people, when united by necessity, could produce wonders. Even now, the numbers astonish. More than 15,000 built, tens of millions of combat hours flown, thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed. But beyond the statistics lies something deeper, a legacy measured not in metal, but in lives. Every pilot who climbed out of a burning jug and lived to see another dawn was a chapter in that legacy. Every bomber crew that looked up to see the blunt-nosed silhouette of a P-47 above them felt that same pulse of gratitude. The jug was their guardian angel, and angels, as history knows, are often fierce. The passing years have not erased its influence. In the world's surviving Thunderbolts, the lineage of all modern strike aircraft can be felt. The faith in armor, the emphasis on survivability, the belief that precision and protection go hand in hand. When the A-10 Thunderbolt II first flew in the 1970s, its name was no coincidence. Republic, the company that built the jug, chose it deliberately. The new aircraft carried cannons and armor, designed to fly low and save soldiers on the ground. It was, in every sense, the spiritual child of its namesake. Pilots of the A-10 affectionately call it the Warthog. But when they hear its official title, Thunderbolt II, they know the name is sacred. Some say the P-47 belongs to the past, a relic of propellers and analog dials. Yet to others it represents something eternal, the ability to endure, to fight on even when battered, to come home when hope seems lost. It was the plane of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. It was loud, heavy, and unglamorous. And perhaps that's why it endures. It reminds us that victory does not always belong to the sleekest or fastest, but to the ones who can take the most punishment and keep moving forward. In the quiet of a museum hangar, where sunlight filters through high windows and dust drifts like ash, a single P-47 stands. Its wings stretch wide, paint faded, serial numbers barely visible. Children press their faces to the railing, eyes wide. A volunteer guide, a veteran long past middle age, tells them about the war, about how these machines flew from muddy fields in England, how they faced flak and fighters and weather that would make the sky itself seem hostile. The children listen, and for a moment they understand that courage isn't loud or shiny. It's persistence. It's the hum of an engine that refuses to quit. Outside, a breeze stirs the flag. Somewhere, far off, a radial engine starts up, one of the few Thunderbolts still flying. The sound rolls across the air like a slow heartbeat, deep and sure. People look up, shielding their eyes against the sun. The aircraft rises, steady, graceful in its own heavy way. The propeller flashes silver. For a few seconds, the past is present again. The war, the fear, the hope, all of it returns in that single sound. Then it fades into the horizon, leaving silence behind, and the world feels older, wiser, quieter. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt was never the prettiest, never the fastest, never the most famous, but it was, beyond doubt, one of the greatest. It carried the weight of nations on its broad wings, turned the tide of battle with fire and grit, and brought more men home than history will ever count. It was the kind of machine that doesn't just win wars, It defines what it means to survive them. Even now, when the wind passes over an empty runway, some say you can almost hear it, the deep echo of a double Wasp engine, the faint crackle of gunfire, the whisper of propeller blades cutting through cloud. It's the voice of a generation that built, flew, and fought with everything they had. The voice of thunder that once rolled across a world at war, and still, in memory, never stops, because some legends don't fade. They just fly higher,